clear that rabbis, when they are ordained at their seminaries, are equipped with knowledge, the knowledge that their seminaries deem necessary to acquire the title of rabbi. It doesn't take rabbis too long to discover that in the field there is a disconnect between what they know and what they want to teach and what their congregants or others who might come to their adult education classes are really interested in learning and seeking. Sid Schwarz has been an entrepreneur in the American synagogue life, in the field of Jewish education, for a long time. He's written extensively. We know him from Panim, which he founded and ran for many years, from the many, many articles that he's written, the books that he's written. And in 2002, Sid was awarded the prestigious Covenant Award for his pioneering work in the field of Jewish education. 2007, he was named by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in North America, and he serves as a senior fellow for Klal. So, with no further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Sid Schwarz to this podium to hear your words and to teach us.
Thank you, Jerry, for the introduction, and I really appreciate the invitation from Steve and the Planning Committee to do this talk, primarily because about 6 months ago I was commissioned to write a chapter for a book that's coming out, published by Sage Publications, called Religious Leadership in America. It'll be a 2-volume study, which probably will come out in a year and a half, given how long it takes for books to come out. And I'd gone to my computer at least a half dozen times to try and kind of like get that thing out, and it wasn't happening. And when the invitation came to prepare this talk, there's nothing like a deadline to kind of get the juices flowing. So what I'm going to be presenting this morning is actually an excerpt from a larger study, which is called Jewish Megatrends, and I'm hoping there'll be a way to get that out into the Jewish communal bloodstream and thought stream sooner than the book will see the light of day. And you have a handout which has a couple citations. I'm going to get to there in a few minutes. I want to develop a little bit of an analysis first. And the title for the talk is "The Torah We Know, the Torah Jews Want," and I have to here give credit to Rabbi Harold Schulweis. He's really one of the great Jewish rabbis and great Jewish leaders of our generation. One time he gave a talk, and he said the following, and I probably quoted this more than any other thing I've ever heard from in my career. He said the following. He says, "Rabbis have answers to questions that Jews no longer ask." And that's really the inspiration for this talk. And I really want to talk about the problem, and I don't want to sugarcoat it because, the old Apollo thing, Houston, we have a problem. When you work with an organization, the Romans told to reframe problems as challenges. And probably when the article finally comes out, I'll use the word challenge, not a problem. But Beinenu, on the inside, it's a problem. We have a major problem. And let me just document some data points. Then I want to step back and take a broader picture of why we're in the predicament we're in, and then I want to move to 4 propositions with evidence from each of the propositions, and hopefully we'll have time for you to kind of react to the propositions and see whether they align with your own experience and thinking, or whether you see it differently. So that's what I'm looking forward to be doing. So some of the evidence of the problem. I want to look at kind of the main touchstones of the organized Jewish community. Jewish Federation system. In 1985, they counted 900,000 donors. This past year, they counted 450,000 donors. That's a 50% drop over the course of the past 25 years. The reform movement, as you know, in 2009 had to cut 20% of its budget, about 60 staff people nationally. There's been a movement afoot for the past decade of major congregations in the URJ threatening to pull out of the system. And there's attrition in the reform movement. The recent strategic plan put out by United Synagogue Conservative Judaism that indicated the following, and this is only the last decade data. If you go back 25 years, the data is even scarier. But a study that came out just about 6 months ago indicated that there has been a 14% decline just in the last 9 years of the time frame of the study 9% decline in overall membership in United Synagogue congregations. However, if you isolate the Northeast, which is where the biggest numbers are, that 9-year decline is 30%. In addition, looking at the national membership of the United Synagogue, only 9% of United Synagogue membership is under the age of 40. If you were a company and you had that data, you'd sell. Finally, in the past 15, 20 years, we've had a proliferation of seminaries. It's a very ironic phenomenon that at the same time that our synagogue market is shrinking, we have an increase in number of seminaries out there training rabbis. What's that about? You really have to ask that question. I do retreats under the aegis of Klal for Rabbis Without Borders for students. I do it twice a year. I now have 9 seminaries sending students to these retreats. 9 seminaries. But we know the market is shrinking, so I think we have to ask that question. I paint this picture because communal institutions reflect a set of values and priorities. They represent our Torah, because institutions are simply a reflection of how we want to do our work based on the way we understand the community to be functioning. And it's abundantly clear that this Torah, that which we know, the Torah that we've grown up in and some of us have helped establish, is not precisely the Torah that Jews want. And we have to ask the question, why? Now, I've been doing work for more than a decade with rabbis and synagogues around the country, and I noticed the following phenomenon. It's just a matter of human nature. When you're in a crisis mode, there's even an expression in English for this. They'll say, put your head down, bear down, and just plow through, right? And I wind up finding myself saying to rabbis more and more, they've got to find a way not to work harder, which is what the first default position is for responsible leaders who are heading up an institution in crisis, but rather work smarter. And what that means is actually not putting your head down, but picking your head up. What it means is taking 3 steps back from the problem that is right in front of you, your crises du jour, and to say, why do I have 4 crises du jour every day? And it's not going to be solved if I simply put in another hour or 2 each day or another 10 hours a week, which is what most rabbis do, and we know where that leads. It leads to burnout. Okay? So what I want to do here is reflect in my presentation what it would look like for us to take a step back from putting our head down and picking our head up to look at a slightly wider horizon. It's kind of like if you're filming a movie and suddenly the camera pulls back. So you're not looking at the crisis in the household where there's some tension in the family, but you kind of see the block, the village, the city, the country, the world. And to do that, I want to say a few words about generational change. Okay? Because we can't understand our current predicament if we don't understand the passage of the generations. And I want to specifically cite 3. My parents' generation, my generation, and my children's generation. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. They were both born in Europe. Their family started in the shtetls of Poland. They moved to Berlin. They had choice. My father came to this country on the last successful voyage of the St. Louis. The next voyage was called the Voyage of the Damned. He came on the voyage just before that Voyage of the Damned, came at age 16 when he was still able to be ransomed out of Berlin by an aunt and uncle in Brooklyn. My mother went the other direction. She went to pre-state Palestine, to the Yishuv, where her family lived for a while until they couldn't make it financially, and they moved to the States, which is where my parents met. My mother was actually in the first class of stewardesses on LL Airlines. Did an old pond when I was an undergraduate, and one day we were asked to buy Yediot Achronot, the Sunday edition, which comes out Friday, of course, right? And there was an article about the changing uniforms of stewardesses over the generations, and my mom was the first picture. When my parents established a family in America, they and their generation were characterized by 3 things. Number 1, they were deeply scarred by the Holocaust, because both had lost most of their family in the war. They also were inspired by the birth of the state of Israel because they lived to see that, and they saw that as a future hope for the Jewish people. And third, they were deeply indebted to America, which gave them the opportunity to live the freest experience that the Jewish community had ever known in its history. I'm a boomer. I'm a classic boomer, born in 1953. One of my earliest memories of my childhood was at age 14, in the months leading up to the Six-Day War. My parents on the phone round the clock making phone calls to raise money for Israel, and there was a palpable feeling that if a war happened, if several Arab armies invaded Israel, Israel would be destroyed. And I remember the sense that somehow this was a family crisis. This wasn't a problem happening in a country overseas. It was a family crisis that the promise of the Jewish people and the Jewish future was at risk. 9 years later, I was on a bus, the number 5 bus, and it gives me chills because we know the suicide bombing is the number 5 bus. We've all been on it in Tel Aviv, goes around Dizengoff. I'm on the number 5 bus in Tel Aviv when the bus put on the Chadashot on the hour, and they announced the rescue raid in Entebbe, when Jewish passengers were actually isolated. Palestinian terrorists had hijacked a plane. Non-Jews were allowed to go. The Jews were held as hostages, and the Israelis mounted a 3,000-mile rescue mission to save the Jews in that airport. And I remember that moment when the Chadashot played, all the traffic on Dizengoff stopped, including our bus. Everyone stood up, and we sang Hatikvah. A third formative memory of my childhood, I made my first trip to Russia with USY in 1970, visiting and refusing. So I went back several times afterwards, and my activism for Soviet Jewry was the defining activism of my childhood, of my teen and young adult years. 25 years later, I was the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Washington and was one of the organizers of the Summit Rally for Soviet Jewry in 1987, December 6th. Day I'll always remember because I was standing on the stage with then Vice President George Bush, with recently released prisoner of conscience Natan Sharansky, and with Peter Paul and Mary Hussein. And on that day when we expected maybe 25,000 people to come, 250,000 people showed up. And on the next morning when Ronald Reagan met with Premier Gorbachev, the meeting began with him holding up copies of the Washington Post and the New York Times saying, 250,000 people rallied to free Soviet Jews, and he said very clearly, Prime Minister Gorbachev, there will be no free trade, there will be no reduction in arms, there will be no most favored nation trade status unless you free Soviet Jews. I share those because if my parents' generation was the generation of tragedy and rebirth, my generation experienced what I would call the heroic stage of Jewish communal life. The heroic stage, Six-Day War, Entebbe raid, Summit Rally for Soviet Jewry, which turned the corner on that human rights struggle. What about my children's generation? Now we're talking about Generation X, Y, and millennials, born in the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. What's formative for that generation? They lived during the Conference on Racism in Durban in 2001, which suddenly, with the passage of apartheid South Africa, now elevated Israel to the #1 status of pariah nation in the world. A few months later, Second Intifada, suicide bombings throughout Israel. Given the freedom of Israel, ironically, the ability of both media and human rights organizations to report on every abuse of human rights issues in Israel became the new brand of Israel. Israel was no longer the David that defeated Goliath in 1967. It was the nuclear power in the Middle East that was oppressing poor Palestinians. And most recently, Israel invades Gaza, Goldstone Commission, a committed Jew, who suggests that both Hamas and Israel were likely guilty of war crimes. People didn't hear the Hamas part, they heard the Israel part loud and clear. The brand was badly tarnished. Israel went from a point of rallying cry and a unification totem for the Jewish world to, for my children's generation, Generation X, Y, and millennials, something that at best created ambivalence, and for many, a desire to run the other way. In my book, Finding a Spiritual Home, I actually talk about what I call the New American Jews. It's the attempt to identify Generation X, Y, and millennials, and I suggest 5 characteristics. And this is the market, and I want to say that what I want to do here, and I'm going to begin and end with it, is that it is critical when we move away from head down, crisis ahead, to head up. What's going on here? We need to ask 2 questions. What is going on in the market we're trying to address? A, and B, what is going on in the marketplace in which we function? Market and marketplace. I want to come back to that again and again because all too many Jewish leaders and those of us who are involved in training rabbis don't ask those questions about market and marketplace. So market. Here are 5 characteristics of what I call the New American Jew. Number 1, they don't respond emotionally to appeals based on the Holocaust or Israel. and they won't judge Israel by a different moral standard than they will any other country. 2, they are disinclined to show automatic deference to religious or community leaders. 3, they do not derive their sense of place from their Jewish connections. 4, while aware of historical anti-Semitism and the ongoing anti-Israel animus in the world, they have no persecution complex. And 5, they're willing to shop for alternative religious forms and experiences. Now, taken collectively, let's think about the big picture again, okay? Let's step back, generational change. My parents, part of the tragedy rebirth generation that builds the community that we enjoyed in the 20th century. The boomer generation, which has now moved into leadership in the community, is part of the heroic generation. We have these memories. We don't know why younger Jews don't stand up and salute when we talk about the Jewish people. Because that third generation, Generation X, Y, millennials, are part of a generation that I call the post-tribal generation. The post-tribal generation. And what's so important about understanding that is that the primary agenda of the Jewish community for the 20th century, from the end of World War II until even the present day, is what I call ethnic survivalism. It's about ethnic solidarity, and let's put the wagons around in the circle because we still have enemies in the world. And to a post-tribal generation, ethnic survivalism falls flat. It does not speak to their interests. It does not speak to their formative experiences that have shaped their consciousness. Now let's take it one more step backwards and pick our head up one more notch. Jews all too often think only about what's going on in the Jewish world, the Jewish community, but it will not serve us well unless we see what's going on in the bigger picture. The problem that we face with this post-tribal generation is not, is not unique to the Jewish community and the Jewish people. It's part of a larger American phenomenon which we must understand. The most recent book that came out by Robert Putnam, who came to prominence with his book Bowling Alone, but this is the next book, a book I recommend you called American Grace, outlines and details the crisis of what he calls religious inheritance. It simply means how well one generation passes on religious loyalty and identity to the next generation. Okay? What does he find? If you take away blacks and Hispanics who do way better at passing on religious inheritance than others, if you take them away, less than 50% of Americans are successful at passing on their religious heritage to their children. And if we take those underperforming religious groups, leave blacks and Hispanics aside, take the underperforming groups, and we isolate the Jews, compare them to the other unsuccessful groups, we are the least successful, the most unsuccessful, whichever way you want to put it. Less than 30% of Jews are successful at passing on their heritage, less than 30%. That tells us a picture about the market and the marketplace. One other data from the Putnam book. In 1955, they did a survey of Americans about religious preferences. And they asked a question about, what denomination or religion do you most identify with? 97% of Americans identified a denomination or some religious faith community. 97%. Okay? Those who, the remaining 3%, were classified in the 1955 study as the nuns. N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, okay? Okay? Because there's a whole chapter in Putnam's book that talks about the rise of the nuns, which is not about the Catholic Church and its convents, but rather indicating that by 1996, when they did theirs, from which they took their survey data, the nuns had climbed to 25%. From 3% to 25%, Jerry says it's probably higher. Could be. Certainly in Jewish world, that's collectively in America. So take what I said about blacks and Hispanics and other mainline Protestants, which we think are in the worst shape, and we're in worse shape, okay? It's clearly higher in the Jewish world. But overall, collectively in America, 25% would say no. I want to go back to the term post-tribal. I've argued in my book, Judaism and Justice, that there are two categories of Jews out there, tribal Jews and covenantal Jews. We are the tribal Jews. We still have the sense of solidarity, ethnic loyalty to the Jewish people, care about Jewish continuity. We'll come to meetings like this, worry about how we pass on our heritage. The Jewish community has been shaped by tribal Jews, and they assume or hope that the audience also are tribal Jews, but they're not. They're post-tribal Jews. I like to call them covenantal Jews, which means that they're Jews in potentia. Tribal Jews things, a lot about survivalism, about enemies of the Jewish people, about what it will take for us to survive. And they will privilege Jewish interests and Jewish causes over others. Covenantal Jews will not. They're more universal, they're less parochial, they're more altruistic. They can and will resonate to Jewish messages if put in the right framework. But the way the Jewish community now is still delivering its message is still so tribal that most covenantal Jews of Generation X, Y, and Millennials don't recognize it, and they are voting with their feet. So the question I want to pose and spend the rest of my time on some solutions, because I actually think that parts of this analysis are out there and been out there for a while. What I think is where we fall short is we don't have a lot of answers to it. So after we all shake our heads, and maybe I've given you a few pieces of data you haven't heard, but it fits a picture that anyone in this room has seen evidence of, I want to spend most of my time now focusing on 4 propositions about where the Jewish community might go, because I believe that in any social phenomenon, within the rubric of decline are the seeds of Renaissance. But it's only a very small minority of people who really have leadership skills and vision who can see what is the promise within the decline. If you're in the private sector, people who buy into a down market are the ones who make big money, right? Because they say, this market's not going to keep going down. I think there's stocks here I can bet on, right? But what does that look like in the social context, within institutions, within religious subcommunities? I want to suggest that we have to be training rabbis to have that kind of leadership vision. In the midst of this decline and these very scary statistics, where are the seeds of Renaissance? And I want to put out 4 propositions now to suggest what they may be. And they fall under, and you have a little handout with the propositions. For each one of them, I'm going to give some evidence, some of it hard data, some of it part of my own experience of where I've lived and worked, and some anecdotes. And this is where I really would value some feedback and give and take to see whether you see it the same way or differently. It's a work in progress. So the 4 areas revolve around Chokhmah, wisdom, Tzedek, social justice, Kehillah, community, and Kedusha, what I would call, for the time being, holiness. Proposition 1. In an age of globalization, the Jewish community needs to offer multiple avenues to explore Chokhmah, the wisdom of our sacred texts put into the larger context of the world's religions and in the lingo of contemporary culture. Where's the evidence? Well, we do see some very serious learning communities. The whole notion of the past generation that if you want to reach Jews, you need to kind of offer Jewish light doesn't work, doesn't resonate. Jews who want excellence in every realm of their lives, they want, the best theater subscription, the best symphony, the best homes, the best cars, the best consumer goods, do not want Jewish light. They want serious, authentic Judaism, which is one of the reasons why Chabad flourishes. Even if people don't take on that observance pattern, it feels authentic, it feels real. But you don't have to just look in the Orthodox world to find Jews looking for serious engagement with Chokhmah, with the wisdom of the Jewish tradition. Look at the success of Machon Hadar here in New York. Look at how many young Jews go and study at a place like Pardes in Israel. Some of you may not be aware of, go to a website called Madrega.com. Madrega, M-A-D-R-E-G-A. It is a website started by a layperson out of Canada, who is now the hub of dozens and dozens of Musar circles all around America. I happened on to about a year ago and did a retreat at my synagogue about Musar, and now we have 4 Musar groups going on in our own synagogue, all using this stuff coming out of Madrega.com, studying Musar on their own. Okay? It's going on all over America. Or take the phenomenon of Limud. In 1980, in the United Kingdom, they started the first Limud. Okay, how many of you have been to Limud ever in the UK? I was privileged to be the last year. Now there are 60 Limud spin-offs all around the globe. Not only in North America, but in Europe and South America and South Africa as well. 60 and growing, okay? This is self-run Jewish learning from some of the best Jewish teachers in the world. There's something going on here in terms of Jews seeking out Jewish wisdom, and not necessarily in the conventional institutions that we believe can deliver it, that being synagogues. We need to take note of it. But I want to go beyond it because I think that the search for Chokhmah within the Jewish community, among the market that we're talking about, the post-tribal generation market cannot just be in the lingo of Judaism, because they are desperate to see it in a larger context. You know how many Haggadot have crossed my desk which weave in the traditional Haggadah text with quotes from Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela? This is the generation that we're looking at. That speaks to wisdom in a broader context. In the late 90s, at Panim, we got funding from the Righteous Person Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, and the Ford Foundation to create a program called E Pluribus Unum. I want to share this because it's an important piece of data. We had really fine-tuned the idea of how to use a methodology that takes the wisdom of Jewish tradition to inspire greater commitment to activism, leadership, and social justice. And I started asking myself the question, would this work beyond the boundaries and the parameters of the Jewish world, the Jewish wisdom? So we got funding to run a program called E Pluribus Unum, which we created, which brought together every summer an equal number of Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and last year Muslims as well, to explore the nexus between religion, social justice, and the common good. What I saw happening there just spoke volumes about where post-tribal Jews are at, because many Jews, young Jews, these were Jews who were entering college freshmen, okay? You put them with the best Jewish teachers in the world, and they still kind of like, ho-hum, you know, it's like every Jew is from Missouri, the show me state, like show me. Like, make the case, you know? Tell me why it's going to be Jewish, because I'm not so sure. And they're so quick to push it away that it feels too tribal and too parochial. But in the context of other young people from other faith traditions, they're amazed when they're challenged about, like, what do you believe about God? What do you believe about tradition? What do you believe about worship? What do you believe about spirituality? And suddenly you have Jews wrestling with, well, what is my language? How do I respond to that? And they come out of Jewish communities that have not given them the equipment to even articulate that because they come out of these ethnic survival cocoons that we've created. And just to make the point that this is not only liberal Jews, this past Shabbat I was invited to a bat mitzvah at another synagogue, and I bumped into an alumnus of the Panim program, a graduate of Ramaz, okay, one of the flagship Orthodox schools in America. What she's done as a result of her Panim experience from Ramaz is on campus she got very involved with something called the Interfaith Youth Corps out of Chicago. Some of you may know about it, which actually is creating interfaith hubs on campuses all over the country to explore issues of justice from an interfaith perspective. And now she's waiting for permission from her college to do a year fellowship in Bethlehem working with Palestinians. Okay? Why? Because she learned the message of Judaism around Chachmah, but she will not exercise it simply within the parochial walls of the walls of the Jewish community. We need to understand that desire to see the Chachmah on a broader plane. And the last piece of evidence, perhaps most relevant to this audience, because I think the future is all about interfaith and not looking at this only from the Jewish perspective. Two seminaries in the past couple of years are on the road to looking about training religious leaders on an interfaith basis. Andover Newton is on the verge of a merger with Hebrew College Rabbinical School. They've already moved into the same building, and they're doing a lot of cross-referencing of the classes, which students have already taken for several years. And in California, the Claremont School of Theology is now launching a new seminary which will train Christian and Muslims together, okay? This is the wave of the future, and we're behind the curve. Proposition number 2. At a time when our political culture seems so dysfunctional, and the social and environmental threats to the planet grows exponentially every year, the Jewish community needs to provide ways to advance tzedek in the world. So some of you are aware of this. In my book, Judaism and Justice, I document the explosion of new social justice organizations that frame tzedek in a Jewish key. And by the way, it happened in a very concerted period of time. It happened between 1979 and 1989. No less than a dozen organizations were founded during that period of time. American Jewish World Service, New Israel Fund, Mazon, Jewish Funds for Justice. I can go on, okay? Get the book. And I argue that the reason those organizations were founded was precisely because in the 70s and early 80s, the Jewish community was actually turning inward, was becoming more parochial at a time when Amka was going the other direction. Now, there's reason for that, okay? We felt ourselves under assault. We started getting stats about intermarriage, about assimilation, about non-affiliation. The Jewish community, the stewards of the Jewish world, who are tribal, saying, okay, we got to kind of pull the wagons around in a circle and kind of really work on issues of Jewish continuity. If I had $1 for every Jewish continuity commission in the country, I'd be a rich man, okay? That's the focal point. But it was precise, that was the head-down version. If you picked your head up, Jews were saying, we want something more open. And the interest and the growth of the universe of Jewish social justice groups, okay, and I'm looking, Rachel Cowan was at the center of that when she was still at the Cummings Foundation. They funded so many of these groups and got them off the ground and provided that they needed capital for it. They were the social capital, you were the real capital for it, okay? Is something to be noted. That is telling us something. Part of the success of Panim, which I was privileged to lead for 21 years, is that we took Jews who had one step out of the Jewish world, okay? They all were, for the most part, bar mitzvah graduates, but they were like already, you know, they already had the show me thing, you know, like too much Jewish stuff, like I did that, I'm out of here. But the message they heard was not when you hear a given version of God, Torah, and Israel, stand up and salute. It was rather the message they heard was there's a way to take Jewish wisdom and use it to essentially make a difference in the world. It may be around an issue related to the Jewish people or Israel, the Jewish community, but it just might likely be somewhere else because, and we were willing to utter this heresy in the Jewish world, but something that is totally part of the reality of the young generation we work with. Jews are not the most vulnerable people on the planet. Like, you know, you say that in certain Jewish contexts, it's like, that is heresy, okay? You know, you can be excommunicated for saying and acting on that. Because part of what has driven the Jewish community, its tribal impulse for so long, is to say, we are at risk, okay? So rally around the flag. Mordecai Kaplan had a great quote, which says, it's long past time, he said this sometime around 1920, okay? Talk about looking into the future. It's long past time that Judaism stopped being a complex and began being a civilization. And we're still living that. We're still living out a complex that the world's out to get us and we're going to disappear. But that doesn't even pass the lab test with the post-tribal generation of Jews from Generation X, Y, and Millennials. Look at the interfaith organizing that's being led by Jewish Funds for Justice. A lot of that is on an interfaith basis. Faith-based community organizing that's not just about Jewish issues, but where synagogues are linking up with churches that have very different issues in the Jewish community, which is, you know, still out in middle-class suburbs. I'll give you one other piece of evidence from my congregation. I founded a Reconstruction synagogue in Bethesda, and I'm still privileged to lead services on occasion, and I do one special project a year. So last year, I went at the invitation of an Israeli organization called Tevel B'Tzedek, which is kind of the Israeli American Jewish World Service, led by Rabbi Micha Odenheimer. They do wonderful work in Nepal, and they were given money to get on the ground in Haiti right after the earthquake. So Micha reached out to me and asked me to go and work with the team of a dozen Israelis who had been there since the earthquake to do a kind of a Jewish program. It's a whole other story because it turned out it was a challenge because they were almost all secular Israelis, and to make that more Jewish was a challenge, which I'll tell you some other time offline. Okay, but the point was, while I was there, I connected not only with the Israeli team on the ground, but with a very charismatic young Haitian minister named Pastor Johnny, who had founded a church and started a school with 160 children. When I went back to Adash Shalom, I essentially told the story of Pastor Johnny, my experience in Haiti. We started a Haiti project and raised a significant amount of money, which we sent down to Pastor Johnny's school. And our plan was to do a service mission to Haiti with members of the congregation. Now, in the Christian world, this is not a new idea. Churches have been doing service missions all around the globe for decades. I'd love to know if we could come up with more than a half dozen synagogues in America that have done their own service missions. I don't think so. I'm not aware of it. If you know, tell me about it, okay? Very, very rare. Great, there's one. Okay, we'll work on it. I want to hear more, okay? So, okay. So, we had a last-minute glitch because the sponsor for our trip wound up deciding that as of December 15th, they no longer wanted untrained volunteers. So suddenly we were in crisis. We had to find another sponsor. We found it last minute. We had 2 weeks to fill the mission. We took 20 spots with a group called the Fuller Center for Housing, which was started by the guy who founded Habitat for Humanity. In 10 days, we filled 20 spots, people paying their own way, over $3,000 to go down December 26th for a week to build houses and to interact with Pastor Johnny's community. It took 10 days to fill that trip up. Something's going on here, friends, okay? People said, this is how I want to live out what it means to be Jewish in the world. Proposition number 3. At a time when technology has made meaningful social intercourse much harder to come by, the Jewish community must offer places where people can find support in times of need communal celebration in times of joy, and friendships to make life fulfilling. Look at the phenomenon of independent minyanim. I mentioned earlier Machon Hadar. The data is interesting. In the year 2000, we were able to count 6 independent minyanim in America. There's a conference actually coming up this weekend in Washington. The Machon Hadar has been doing it for the past 4 years. They now count about 120 independent minyanim. And I spoke to Ellie Confer this past week in working on my paper. The fact of the matter, they're not counting all the minyanim that are happening in synagogues. Now, I actually am not aware, tell me if I'm wrong, of anyone who's done a study of minyanim in synagogues, second minyanim apart from the main service, okay? I talk about it a lot in Finding a Spiritual Home. I'm guessing, because I'm not aware of any hard data on it, I'm guessing that there are probably between 200 to 300 such minyanim in America, okay? I'll let me be proven wrong on the high side or low side. That's my guess, just having done a lot of work in the American Jewish community and synagogues. This means people who are saying, I don't want to be in the main service, I don't want to be at the bar mitzvah, I want something that's more do-it-yourself, where there's more energy, whatever else. And in fact, when I travel and visit synagogues, I take the highest piece of technology that I carry with me, especially in Shabbat, which is my heart meter. And I go to the main service and it's flatlined. And I go to independent minyan in the library or the social hall, and it goes through the roof. And that's with all the mishigas that comes with independent minyanim in a synagogue. And there's a lot, okay? I'm aware of that. But there's something going on here as well. Take the independent minyan phenomenon the way Hadar defines it, add to it 200 to 300 minyanim that are happening in synagogues, and you're seeing Jews who want to do stuff on their own, okay? Now, there are a lot of Jews who just don't even get the prayer thing. So if you take that universe of independent minyanim and minyanim in synagogues, I would say you can multiply that number by at least 3 or 4 to see how many independent study groups exist by Jews who don't want to pray, but want to somehow engage Jewishly, okay? Again, a study needs to be done here, okay? Studying everything from Kabbalah to Jewish history, Jewish book clubs, Jewish cinema clubs, they're all over the place. And the phenomenon, by the way, is one documented in a book that came out in the early 1990s by Robert Wethnow, Sharing the Journey, thank you, Sharing the Journey, in which he talks about the interest of Americans, people of faith, and I use that term in quote because Jews don't talk that language, but people who are looking for small groups in which they can be with other people whose values are in sync with their own values, where they're creating their own spiritual community, without a building, without a clergy, without staff, without a budget, but it's sharing the journey, and Jews are doing it as well. We've yet to find a way to capture this. In Finding a Spiritual Home, I talk about a new paradigm of the American synagogue, and I talk about how we need to move from what still is the predominant paradigm of the American synagogue, which is the synagogue center, to a new paradigm, and I have 4 synagogues which I use to illustrate and extract the new model, which I call the synagogue community. And if I can say in one word, which took me 250 pages to explicate, part of the message of moving from synagogue center to synagogue community is to move away from our obsession around membership. How big is your synagogue? How many people are paying dues? To having a commitment to ownership. Don't ask the membership question, okay? Ask the ownership question. How many Jews own what's happening here, and how do you make them into owners? How do you make them into owners? If you look at the United Synagogue study that came out 6 months ago, interesting that they're suggesting, I hear it's controversial, I think, Mark, you can probably tell me more about this, okay? Because I hear the rumblings, okay? The attempt of that study is to say, let's stop talking just about synagogues and talk about kehilot, okay? I think it's the same notion. I mean, those of us, the small number of us that have been doing synagogue change work for the past 15, 20 years, okay, know this to be true, but getting that into the consciousness of the Balabatim who run the American synagogues is a whole other kettle of fish. But this notion that let's talk about community and ownership and not about membership, because the post-tribal generation are, as we know, not joiners. If they're not joiners, we need to change the business model. Fourth and finally, in an age when we better understand the shortcomings of capitalism and the culture of consumerism, the Jewish community must offer a glimpse of Kedusha, experiences that provide transcendent meaning and a sense of purpose. So here's my biggest gripe with the Jewish world and those who are the stewards of it. I hear every place I go that, the problem in Jewish life is that it's too expensive and it takes too much time. Hogwash. The fact of the matter is that Jews spend enormous amounts of money and will give enormous amounts of time to places that will feed and nourish their spiritual sense of self. The evidence is everywhere. Jews are among the most avid spiritual seekers in America. Look at a book written by Tony Schwarz called What Really Matters? Searching for Wisdom in America. Tony Schwarz used to write for the New York Times, visited about a dozen spiritual retreat centers in America. And he notes in a footnote, now Schwarz I assume is Jewish, I don't know him personally, but given, he's not a relative either, there's no T in my name, okay? He notes in a footnote in the book, like in chapter 9 or 10, he says, yet again, most of the people here are Jewish. These are not Jewish retreat centers, by the way, okay? Because Jews are hungry for a place that will feed their soul, and they're not finding it in synagogues. So instead of us asking the question about why did those Jews betray the Jewish world and not join the synagogue or leave the synagogue, the question we have to ask ourselves, why are we still talking about the Torah we know as opposed to thinking about the Torah Jews want? And if you look at things like the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, again, Rachel provided wonderful leadership there. Think about the number of, and there's several staff people from IJS here, the number of rabbis that have been trained at IJS, rabbis who really are understanding that there's another way to approach the rabbinate, to deepen what they experience at IJS and bring it back to the synagogue is an important thing to note. Look at the success of places like Elat Chaim in Connecticut or Chachmat Halev in the Bay Area, and the interest in going to those kind of spiritual retreat centers. We need to mainstream this phenomenon and not keep it on the fringes. So in conclusion, the tribal Jews who are the stewards of the Jewish community need to start paying attention to the covenantal Jews who are their children. The Torah we know and the community we built is not what younger Jews want. Who are the Jews we're trying to program for and we're trying to engage? They're Jews who are seekers. The Jews who want a Torah, a new Torah, of a newly imagined Jewish community. They are Dorshei Chachma, seekers of wisdom, Dorshei Tzedek, seekers of social justice, Dorshei Kihila, Jews who want true community, Dorshei Kedusha, Jews who really want a sense of the holy. Either the Jewish community will fill those needs, or Jews will go elsewhere. It requires a vision to understand the new reality, and the courage to reimagine a Jewish community that can not only survive, but perhaps bring about a renaissance of Jewish life that will make us a role model for other faith communities in America. Thank you. So I'd love to get some feedback on the propositions, your own experience. I'm more interested in where you disagree than where you agree, but I'll take all comers. Please.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Could you identify yourself
Yes,
for my benefit and others as well?
Rachel Gervitz.
Thank you.
Rabbi in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So yes, yes, and yes. Everything I was nodding all the way through, and personal experiences and work that I'm doing very much plugs into the model that you're talking about. One of the things I've been starting to think about is somebody who's working as a congregational rabbi, still kind of is committed to that being the hub, but wanting to set myself up very much with what you described and thinking about what that might look like down the line. Is that we know what it looks like now. I think what you described in terms of what it should be looking like or where we should be heading, I'm really completely with you. I agree with everything. What I'm trying to now pay attention to and where the uncertainty is what's the line? What are the factors along the line that joins us from there to there? So whether it be in terms of the process of transforming the financial model, for example, of the congregation, the process which I assume Mr. Dan will address later this afternoon, of transforming the skill set of rabbis to get from where we are to where we want to be going. But what are some of the key factors? If we were thinking of this in terms of strategic planning, strategic management, how do you describe the line that joins these two places?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and that, Dafka, is worth a commission, because it's not just one person answering on a podium in 3 minutes, but it needs a lot of good heads, because a lot of it has to do with the business model of the American synagogue. And the American synagogue is still the primary retail outlet of American Judaism, where Jews get Judaism, and they go there less and less, unfortunately. I'm right now involved with a project called the Jewish Journey Project here in Manhattan. We've got 6 congregations and 2 JCCs reinventing what afternoon religious school ed will look like. I can tell you now that we're 6 months into it, that the educational program and product we put out will be light years better than anything that's been out there in the past. But the program still may not succeed because what we need to do in the next 3 months is convince 6 synagogue boards to change their business model. And even if we raise a boatload of money, which we're planning to do, and we're already well on the way to do that, which will essentially mitigate the financial setback of the synagogues in the first couple of years, anyone who's good with a pencil, okay, and looks at the numbers, will understand that if the Jewish Journey Project is successful, within 5 years, the synagogue will have to defund their religious schools and go to a much more collaborative model that looks way different than what they do. And it also means pushing synagogues away from the current membership model, because I believe that's not the model that will succeed into the next generation. Now, how we do all that and how we pull off these conversations is really challenging. I'm right in the midst of it right now. And I have to say that in my years of consulting to synagogues, the area that I've been least successful is when people who are savvy around business matters and budgets ask me the question about it. I'll throw out a line which I always regret, but I believe it. When I say your current business model won't work into the next generation, they'll say, okay, so what does it look like? Which is what your question is, Rachel, right? And I don't have a great answer yet. I really don't. I'll give you one piece of anecdote. In Washington, 3 major Jewish philanthropists bought what is now the 6th I Synagogue. It was once a synagogue. It became a church. The church moved out and built a mega church in the suburbs. It was up for sale. It was going to become a bar. And a few philanthropists bought it and created this institution. Now, if you get their material, if you go there, it is a very exciting hub of Jewish life, attracting a lot of young people who are urban America, all Generation X and Yers. Not quite millennials yet, because they're only 12 years old. But it's Generation X and Y for sure. However, the dirty little secret of 6 and I is that they have not made it sustainable. It's all happening because the philanthropists behind it are essentially subsidizing it 100%. So there's no one asking for any money. So I can celebrate what's going on there, but okay, will they pay for it? We need to get the answer to that question. Will they pay for it? I'd like to believe that if the Jewish community, the Jewish world puts out programs and institutional models of quality, that Jews will pay for it. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that Jews, have the money and will spend it if it's providing it. But 6 and I is hedging its bets. They're scared to test it. And so you've got, the handful of big givers underwriting it and giving everyone a free ride, which, by the way, don't get me started on this one. Birthright is whoa. I know all the reasons why we should celebrate it, but it is a time bomb that will explode in our face. Because we're taking privileged middle-class Jews and telling them the message you're getting, forget about the Israel message. Short term, yes, they get energized about Israel and Jewish identity, but the long-term message is that someone will pay you to do Jewish. It's free. And that is a time bomb that will explode in our faces in the next 10 to 20 years that we will pay for generations to come. Rachel. I'm Rebecca, I'm sorry. Rebecca, that was Rachel. Rebecca.
Director of Rabbis at Words at Fall. Sid, thank you for laying out what you did. I think you did it beautifully. There is, however, one assumption I really would like to challenge, and that is your one on Hilah, where you say, at a time when technology has made meaningful social intercourse much harder to come by, the Jewish community must offer places where people can support each other and not see. As a Gen Xer who embraces technology, I would say that assumption needs to be tweaked. It's not that technology is...
Tweaked or tweeted?
Well, no, I wouldn't tweet it yet because I think it needs to be tweaked, and then I'm happy to tweet it.
I forget, Rebecca, you promised.
I know. I have found and experienced myself social media, I'm not going to talk technology as a whole, but the aspect of social media that I think the Jewish community is still really behind the ball on is it's in addition to in-person. It's not like you have your life online and your life in real life. No, that's in fact the genius of Facebook is that your lives are mixed, and these two, it's all one and the same, and these communities support each other. And I think what we need to do is, I see, and I've done lots of seminars for rabbis on how to develop a synagogue Facebook page, because a lot of Jewish institutions and others are still using just Twitter and Facebook place to advertise. That's not the way it's meant to be used. It's meant to be used to enhance community interaction in that space, because not everyone's coming to shul every Shabbos, of course not, but you can still have a space on Facebook where you're going to check that page because it's automatically going to go into your feed about, you know, all sorts of activities, simple as sharing what's going on. I mean, I live in Teaneck, and right now we're in a huge crisis mode from the storm. I mean, half of Teaneck still has no power, the schools have been shut for 3 days, you know, and where are you getting information about what's going on but online from both Twitter and Facebook? And so I think that assumption needs to be tweaked so that the assumption is not that online social intercourse is taken away from in-person, but rather there's a much more integrated way to use both the technology and the in-person.
Yeah, Rebecca, you're right. I think that social media is a tool, okay? And I think it's possible, social media can lead to a more isolated experience, okay? But if used wisely, it can lead to more interaction.
Exactly.
And it's a double-edged sword. I think that it has to be paired, okay? I know, and people of my generation all talk about this about our kids, okay? It's scary to me, and this experience with my children is not unique to me, when I note that my kids, in a crisis with a friend, will text their friend as opposed to picking up the phone and getting together with them. And when I suggest, this is something where you should really get together with John or Sally or Mary, whatever it's going to be, okay? They look at me like I told them to jump out a window, okay? I'm very worried about the loss of social skills on the part of the generation that's grown up and are digital natives. I'm very worried about that.
See, and I want to, you know, as you have so astutely defined the covenantal and the tribal in the Jewish world, I think you're dichotomizing in the social media world that same way. It's now just natural to text rather than to talk. And so rather than saying, oh no, you shouldn't be doing that, I think we need to learn, for those of us who are not doing that naturally, that is now the natural mode of communication, and we have to get used to that as a natural mode of communication and master it and use it in those ways.
Yeah, great
so
point.
That's
great point. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Tauber. I'm a professor of Jewish education at JTS, and also I worked a lot in the real world. This is my first year at it. Sorry for saying that. Tongue in cheek a little bit only. As a professor at the seminary, although I got my degree from there. I want to raise a question that may be a little bit uncomfortable for us as leaders, and it's based on my observations at the seminary and out in the world of Jewish education. I have a belief that Judaism lives on because of the care of the grassroots people, but also because throughout thousands of years we have had leaders that have kept us going and have provided sustainability and more thriving. And I'm concerned about where our leaders are coming from. Because all the things that you're talking about require a kind of extraordinary leadership capacity. So I wanted to put out 4 questions that I also, at the seminary where I'm working with people who are becoming Jewish leaders, I see it as something that I need to pay more attention to. So what are the kinds of leaders that we want in the American Jewish community? What are we looking for? I don't know if we've ever really spent a lot of time thinking about that. What are the qualities? And that could be spiritual qualities, emotional, intellectual. What is it that we're looking for? How do we find these people? How do we cultivate? Where are they? Where do we go to find them? And how do we recruit them? How do we get them to want to become leaders? And I'll just speak to my own experience. I have a son who's a sophomore in college, and he's involved in college in Jewish stuff, but in other stuff too. And I said to him, I think you'd be a great rabbi. Not that the rabbi is the only model of Jewish leadership. I don't believe it is. Oh, no way. He wants to be a clinical psychologist. I believe he has wonderful qualities. But what? And me, I'm one of your leaders. Why isn't my son saying, oh yeah, I might think of becoming a rabbi? That's something. How do we recruit them? And then how do we support them when they go on that path and stay on the path so that they don't burn out and leave for other things?
Yeah, great question. On the penultimate question, I'm thinking about, of course, Chaim Potok's The Chosen, right? The Rebbe's son becomes a psychologist, right? So we need to recognize the future spiritual leadership of our community. They may not look like us and have our degrees. It would be nice if we kind of brought some of the skill sets and the excitement that's out there for our younger generation that want to make a difference and frame it in a way so that the rabbinate looks different. Because I think this is as much about, what is the future shape of the rabbinate as it is about what is the future shape of the American Jewish community. But I think those are great questions. And I think the whole thing about what's the talent pool, who are we tapping, who's deciding to come to rabbinical school? Are we getting the right mix or not? So I think it's both a supply issue and a training issue. So I think we need to do a better job of attracting people who never thought they wanted to be a rabbi. Okay? I think the notion of the reluctant prophet model from the Bible is actually a good one. Those who said to God, this is not for me, this is not kind of my job, I'm not cut out for this, turn out to be our best prophets and leaders, right? So supply side, and then training side. Once we get them, and hopefully it'll take us a generation to get a better pool of folks, then how do we train them? Because I think you can take some people who aren't even the top caliber in the pool and train them a little bit differently about some of these new assumptions, the changing marketplace and the changing market. Cheryl?
Thanks. All right. So I actually want to ask a question that I think bridges the two questions that have been asked already, and that's, so if we think about the training, the ongoing training of our rabbis, how do we help them to be able to initiate the change in institutions that already exist, right? All the examples we give when we talk about these kinds of changes are the institutions that were newly created that calling themselves non-institutions to avoid the institutionalization that they think that has become the Jewish community. And when I hear from young rabbis in particular who come with that dream and that vision and then have to get a job because they have to support themselves and run up against the challenges of that, I think that, how to get from, is sort of what Rachel's question was, but in a slightly different way. Like, how do you help them make this part of the larger picture of everything they're doing and not just the sole thing, because it's not always realistic for it to be the only thing.
Yeah. Cheryl, you're putting your finger on something that is something I worry a lot about. I would guess that if we took the entire universe of young people being trained for the rabbinate, okay, you get 90% plus, saying to this analysis, yeah, this is how I see it also.
Exactly.
They may not be able to frame it right now, but they heard it, they would say, yeah, this sounds right, I'm coming out of that generation. And then their first job, they become an assistant rabbi in a synagogue or get their own place, whichever it might be, and they see something very, very different. And their inability to navigate the gap between the vision that is still somewhat inchoate, but they have a sense about where they want to go, and the reality that they see on the ground, the people who come to the committee meetings, the people who are on the board, the people who come to shul, whatever else, is so frustrating because we haven't equipped them with the tools to engage in change management and the OD skills, which tend not to be. I think some senators are moving in this direction. I see actually, and we maybe should talk about this more offline, because I get a balcony view of 9 seminaries at my retreats. I see some senators really making tremendous progress in terms of providing some of these organizational change skill sets to their students, and others are not yet there. And it's a train wreck waiting to happen, because what happens is rabbis with great idealism, I've seen so many crash and burn when they can't even come close to their vision in their first or second job, and they assume that they're not cut out for it. And maybe they're not, but I think if they want to we want to optimize their chances for success, we need to kind of give them some of the skills to say, here's what you're going to face, and here's how you move an institution from point A to point B. So it's a huge issue, and one that I think somebody needs to grapple with. Yeah, please.
So I'm Lisa Goldstein. I'm the new director of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about, having come to this from 15 years in the Hillel world, is that I love these 4 areas of focus, because I think that one of the issues is that we tend to address these problems from the framework of scarcity. And that I think that in and of itself reinforces the scarcity. And if we were able to bring a way of even framing the conversation that is much more about generosity, about abundance, about what we have to offer, about that inspirational approach, instead of sort of the Oigevalt school of Jewish communal work, I think that that would, in and of itself, shift the paradigm in a very profound and productive way.
Yeah.
And I think that by focusing on some of these things, and not just sort of, this is the lack that it's addressing, but these are profound, important, meaningful, life-giving things that we bring to the table to offer. I think we would spend a lot less time chasing down people who might be interested in it and the leaders who would be interested in taking it on.
Yeah, I agree 100%. In the full study, there's a whole section that talks about the issue, and I use the same terms about, the scarcity mindset and the abundance mindset. I use the exact same terms, so if you've been reading my email or looking at my computer, you got the bug in my system. That's where I go off on a rant about birthright, because I think it's a symbol of much that is wrong, not getting people to Israel, but the message. And I make the observation that all the institutions of Jewish life right now, synagogues, JCCs, elder care, if you look in the private sector, places that provide this quality actually make money doing these things. So the Jewish community says, no one will come to these institutions unless we subsidize it, in a significant way and put it at an under market price. But if you look in the private sector, all those places make money. So if we think differently and say Jews actually have money and we can provide that need, let's go for broke. Let's believe in ourselves, have the confidence to say, we don't have to subsidize this anymore. Let's compete in the marketplace and say, if we're going to provide that to Jews, it should pay for itself. I'm there.